Today we're making a 1x1 inch crocodile, and the length of the piece of wood you're going to need if you want to maximize the size of the crocodile on a 1x1 inch piece of wood should be about 16.2 centimeters or 6.3 inches. But if you don't have anything this long, you can make this project from a smaller piece of wood, but then you're just going to need to do a lot more slimming down. So as you can see, this is basically just the length that's required if I want to use as much of this 1x1 inch thickness as possible. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to divide this in half, because the tail is about half of the entire length. If you want to use this as a reference, I'll provide a link to a free to download PDF in the description. Then the half where the body is going to be, it's going to be split almost in half, not quite, because the head is not quite as long as this part. So something like this. And then we're going to make a very basic sketch. So I'm basically going to copy a very rough version of this sketch onto the wood. So here's a triangular shape like that. Then we have this oval shape, and then I'm making a tail that's slightly curved. A little bit of this S shape like that. And then we're going to make the legs starting from this line, just a blob like that. And here the same thing, just a curve like that. Next we're going to make this rough outline. So the head and the tail, we're going to start with rough cuts. And then especially with the tail, we're going to move on to sweeping cuts, so that we will get that curvature over here. And for this project I'm using silver birch, because the tail is going to be very thin and I still want it to be durable, which is why a harder wood is better for this one compared to this Norway spruce that I usually use, which is very, very soft. In the middle here, these sweeping cuts work pretty well. So I'm making this push cut version of the sweeping cut like this. So this part right in the middle is going to be this part, which is the thinnest part of the body, or the mid section of the body. So all of these other areas are quite thick, but then this needs to be slimmed down quite a bit. And we're going to do a similar thing over here, where the neck is going to be. But instead of a sweeping cut, it's going to be more like a V cut. And notice over here, when I'm making the cut this way, I'm not just pulling the knife at random like this. I'm using my thumb as support here, and then I'm just twisting my wrist like this. So I'm not pulling the knife towards this hand, I'm just twisting while pushing the knife away with this thumb. But even so, if you're a beginner, I definitely recommend using a cut resistant glove. Something like this is good enough for now. So we have basically just these two dents on both sides of the neck. Same here where the hind limbs begin. And then we have this nice wavy curvature of the tail. Next we're going to remove about 1/3 of the height. So the crocodile is not going to be this thick, not even close, which means that we need to take about 1/3 of this off. And that can be done like this. So if you have a bigger knife, place it right where you need to split the wood, and then, well, you can use a hammer or just your hand like this. Or you can also just make rough cuts like this to remove the thickness. These gloves are also extremely good for some added grip, so that the piece of wood doesn't slip from your hand. The next thing is to make this entire thing a little bit rounder. So we're not going to need these sharp edges. On the bottom here, we're going to leave these edges where the feet are going to be, but the stomach can be made a little bit rounder. In this step, you're going to need to use a variety of different cuts. So depending on the area, you might do just fine with rough cuts, but you're also going to need sweeping cuts and push cuts. Over here on the bottom, these V-cuts come in very handy so that I can make the edge of the stomach rounder and also separate this area where the front limbs are going to be. And for this, you're just going to need to look at the reference sketch or some photos of crocodiles to get the right proportions. And once you get the cuts going, you can turn them more into stop cuts. And then the same can be done over here. For the hind limbs, we want to create a little bit of separation between the tail and the feet. But since there's so little room over here for holding on, it's best to start with sweeping cuts so that you get a little bit of this inward curve going on. And then it's much safer to make V-cuts. So at this point you should have something like this, where there's two inward corners on both sides, here between the front limb and the side, and the back limb and the tail on both sides. And then the general shape is something like this. And again, the most important thing proportion-wise is that here where the hind limbs start, where the tail also starts, this bit is about in the middle. This way. Now this area between the limbs, somewhere around here, behind the front limbs, is where the highest point of the crocodile is going to be. And that means that we're gonna create a curve all the way through here and make this the highest point. And we're looking for a very smooth curve, so just like a circular curve, nothing special. Just something like this. So an uphill and a downhill. I'm still gonna make this a little bit smoother. That's good enough for now. So I'm still leaving a little bit of height on both ends. Now the roughing part is pretty much over. I'm gonna switch to my main knife. You don't even need a roughing knife really, but it makes the initial shaping a little bit faster. But for the details, it's more important to have something a little more agile. So next we're gonna lower the limbs. So we're gonna remove some wood from all of these areas. Just basic push cuts. Something like that. And then the same on the hind limbs. Rough cuts can also work pretty well. Like that. Next we're going to sketch a few curves, and they are these curves between the sides and the limbs. So just something like this. So with these curves, we're going to separate the legs from the rest of the body and also create this thicker section here in the middle. Now we're just going to make V-cuts with the tip of the blade like this. We can also make this part of the limb a little down turned like this and make it pointy. And now we can start turning these V-cuts into just regular V-cuts where I'm using the long side of the blade and not just the tip. Over here, these small sweeping cuts also come in very handy because we get to lower the shoulder area while leaving a little bit of a higher point over here, which is where the elbow is going to be. Something like this is good enough for now. And then we can do the other side. Then we're going to do basically the same thing for the hind limbs. Remember that in steps like these, it doesn't really matter if you start with the right cut. You can turn a sweeping cut into a V cut later, but it makes sense to start with a sweeping cut if it feels more natural. For example, over here on this side, it feels like the easiest way to remove the wood from here. Same over here. And then I can later on make a sharp corner if that's the finish I want. These hind limbs should be bending differently to the front limbs. They should be bending almost the other way around, because the knee is going to be here, the elbow is going to be here on the top. So the knee is here on the bottom or a little bit to the side, but still we should have some kind of crease over here instead of a bump. So the shape is going to be closer to something like this instead of this downward curve. We can separate the feet from the tail a little bit better with these V-cuts and stop cuts. So similarly to turning sweeping cuts into V-cuts, we can turn V-cuts into stop cuts. Sometimes it's just way easier to make a few V-cuts at first and then make a nicer, smoother shape with stop cuts. And then we can also emphasize the distinction between the stomach and the hind limbs. So we want there to be a clear inside corner, like over here on the sketch. And due to the roundness of the stomach, it goes all the way down here too. Here we're just trying to create this shape where there's a nice outside curve for the knee and an inside curve for the foot. It's just a very simple shape like that. And then we can emphasize the fact that the joint bends the other way compared to this one by removing some wood from here and here. Something like this is good enough for now. We can do some cleanup and some minor details later. And now we'll also do the same on the other side here. Next we're going to make the shape of the tail a little bit better. Basically we want the curves to flow more smoothly, like here on the sketch. So that means that, for example, over here I have unnecessary thickness. The tail should be getting slimmer towards the end, and then I want the curvature to also be really nice and smooth instead of like weird and bumpy like it is now. We're looking for basically an S shape, like over here. For this inside curve, you're gonna need to be making sweeping cuts from both sides. And again here, notice the thumb and just the wrist making the movement. And these much smaller push cuts and these what I call reverse push cuts, where I'm pushing with the thumb, are going to help with making the outside curve smoother, like over here. Just small shallow cuts. I'm gonna put this glove on just to save my thumb a little bit, because sometimes when you're doing a lot of push cuts, this spine of the blade starts to feel kind of uncomfortable on the thumb. Next we're going to work on the head shape a little bit, and that'll start with rounding out these sharp edges on the bottom and these ones on the top also. And we're looking for something like this. So from this I can see that there's too much mass over here and we need to make the nose a little bit pointier. So I'm using these push cuts and these reverse push cuts to slim that down. And then I'm gonna make a few rough cuts, trying to keep them very shallow, and then the tip can be made rounder with push cuts, something like this. But before we work with this one, let's make a little curvature over here. There's too much thickness over here, so I'm gonna create this inside curve over here with these sweeping cuts. So we're trying to create something like this, where this thickest part of the head is also the highest. Then we have a little curve and then a little bump. And now, before rounding this edge, I can move this entire thing a little bit higher. Just a few very shallow rough cuts. Well, this is actually more like a sweeping cut with the faintest possible curve. It's almost straight, but not quite. And now, when I make this rounder, it's almost the right shape already. A little bit more. That's pretty good. It's starting to look like the head of a crocodile. It's maybe still slightly too thick. Looks like something between an alligator and a crocodile, so I'm gonna make it a little slimmer still, and then we're gonna move on. But in your case it might be different, so I suggest looking at this sketch and also some photos. That can really help with having a better understanding of what you need to do. But as you can see over here, I'm just adjusting the shape with these very shallow cuts, taking my time. I don't want to take off too big of a chip. I feel like this corner is too sharp also. It should be slightly rounder, or it's not really a corner, but this widest part of the face. And next, I'm creating a little separation between the very tip of the snout and the rest of the upper jaw with these sweeping cuts. Something like that. This is also something that adds some nice detail to the shape of the head. So from the underside here, I'm making a few of these V-cuts to separate this backside of the lower jaw and the neck. Before we get to any of the finer details, I'm gonna make a few sweeping cuts over here on the tips of the front limbs to also create a place for the feet on those. That's enough to create a little bit of that foot shape. Next we're gonna make the basic shape of the eyes. And the eyes are gonna be pretty much here in the middle of the head, about there. So here I'm gonna make a few sweeping cuts. These are very, very tight sweeping cuts. Just something like that. And then I'm gonna continue these sweeping cuts to the sides a little bit like this. Then a little bit of the same behind the eyes. So we want to leave about that much over here for the eyes. And since the eyes of a crocodile are very protruding, we need to take just a little bit of this wood away from behind the eyes also. I'd say that's pretty good. And then we're also going to separate the eyes from each other with a few very careful and tight sweeping cuts. And at this point already we can continue those sweeping cuts kind of like around the eyes, so that it's not just two square blocks, but the eyes become a little rounder. Next we're going to make the ears, which are just going to be these two curves. So first we're going to take some wood away from this middle area here. And then we can make a few stop cuts. And we're doing this just to reveal a little bit of that shape. Something like that. And then the other side. And then I'm making these slightly flatter so that they look clearly different compared to the eyes. Something like that. Next we're going to make some of the scales of the back. Here's going to be two big ones in this area. And then the rest from about here to somewhere over here in the middle of the tail is going to be pretty much the same. And then the rest over here is just going to be 2 rows. Let's start from this one. So I'm going to make some V-cuts like this. Just 3 distinct inside corners like this. Then we'll leave a little bit of a gap. We're going to make some slightly shallower V-cuts. Now we're just going to make these V-cuts all the way from here to the middle of the tail. And now we're going to make a few more V-cuts that'll serve as kind of like the fading out of these deeper V-cuts. So we're making increasingly shallow V-cuts. Something like this. And next we get to make similar cuts, but this way. And we'll start from the one in the middle. It's best to sketch it first, so that then it's actually in the middle at all times. And now we're gonna have to use the tip of the blade and we'll get something like this. And now we're gonna do that 2 more times for the entire length. And then 2 more times for this midsection. So now 2 more V-cuts, but only on the midsection of the body. And even over here they can stop a little earlier. Now it seems like these sideways V-cuts weren't quite long enough, so I'm gonna extend them a little bit so that this last row also has that scaly texture. Something like this. Before moving on to this part, we need to slim this down so the tail is more pointy. And about half of this remaining area is going to be just one edge. So we can make this sharper. So now we're going to continue these outer rows halfway through this section where they unite into one line of scales. Next we're going to make some toes, 5 toes on the front limbs, which means 4 gaps, and 4 toes on the hind limbs. And these can be made very similarly to the scales on the back, so with these V-cuts with the tip of the blade. Next, I'm separating the hind limbs a little bit better from the tail by creating a V cut over here on the bottom. There are only a couple more details left. We're going to start with the mouth, and that's going to go almost all the way to the back of the head. Somewhere over here, pretty much in the middle, a downward curve. Then we go up again and down and up and down like that. And then we're going to make a V cut. And then the same on the other side. Here I'm just running my fingernail across the cut I just made to make it a little bit cleaner and more visible. You can also add some teeth if you want, like this. Just small V cuts forming these triangular shapes. With the smaller teeth you can basically just press the blade into the wood and you don't even have to make V cuts. A little bit of zigzag like this is super easy, but it goes a long way, I think. This is the shape we're gonna make for the eyes. A little oval shape and a line. Like that. And then the same on the other side. Alright, this project is done. Let me know in the comments if you want a more beginner-friendly version of this crocodile project, or if you have any other ideas for what I should make next.